Hello and welcome back to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill. I am your host, Ramsey Nasser. New York City grabbed global headlines recently with the election of the affordability mayor, Zohran Mamdani. But questions of affordability in the United States and other Western countries are intricately tied up with broader structural dynamics that have evolved over decades. These especially include the decline of unions. Today, we examine a case study on precisely that with an academic and an activist who has been on its front lines. The Western world is in so many ways still living in the shadow of the 2008 financial crisis, which brought economic inequality to the top of the social and cultural agenda. The trajectory leading up to that moment and the almost 20 years of economic and social stagnation since is a neoliberal story of globalization and free trade internationally, commensurate with deindustrialization and a breaking of union power domestically. The attacks on unions were seen most dramatically in the United States, with Ronald Reagan firing air traffic controllers, and in the United Kingdom with Margaret Thatcher taking on the coal miners. But similar dynamics were visible in various forms across different countries. What remained of union structures were neutralized by co-opting their leaders into the professional and managerial class, thus divorcing them from membership that they claimed to represent. And yet, just when capital's victory seemed complete, 2008 birthed a crisis, not just of monetary policy, but of liberalism itself. In the time since Occupy Wall Street, socialism has changed from being a dirty word in the United States to a clarion call for young people who struggle to pay the rent and can only dream of ever owning a house. Recently, new unionization efforts have captured public attention, especially at culturally significant employers, including Starbucks and Amazon, among others. If all of this sounds like unions have been on a roller coaster ride over the past 50 years, it's because they have been. So what can all of us learn from the successes and failures of union history over this period as we attempt to build a better world today? To help us answer that question and a little bit more, we are delighted to be joined today by Dr. Marc Kagan, who I believe I've correctly addressed as doctor. Is that right? Are you a doctor now?
That is right, yes.
Congratulations. So, yes, Dr. Marc Kagan, who is now an academic and author, but is also a former union leader and activist. His fascinating new book is called Take Back the Power, The Fall and Rise and Fall of New York City's Transport Workers Union Local 100, 1975 to 2009, which was just published by Gruyter Brill as part of their series Studies in Political Economy of Global Labor and Work, Volume 7. Dr. Kagan, welcome to the program.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for asking me to do this.
I'm so happy you're here. I'm so excited for this conversation. It's such a pertinent topic. So you write in the book that you joined you participated in the Marxist-Leninist Party in the early 1980s. And in the book's introduction, you write that when you were employed by New York City Transit in 1984, you were, quote, exhilarated because, as an enthusiastic communist who had joined the working class 4 years previous, I had finally made it into one of the strategic industries that the left organizations which had emerged during the 1960s saw as the key to class struggle and revolution. In Pittsburgh or Chicago, that meant steel. In Appalachia, coal. In Detroit, auto. And in New York, the large postal service mail sorting facilities where the 1971 National Postal Strike started as a wildcat, and transit, where strikes had shut down the city twice in the last 20 years. In 1984, the left still had great hopes that the political and workplace battles of the late 1960s and early 70s would shortly resume. We were what Stoughton and Alice Lind called, quote, colonizers, individuals who decided that change had to come or was most likely to come from the working class. They deliberately sought employment in a union of farm workers or an industrial plant or a hospital in order to do political organizing, end quote. As newcomers to transit, we would have to learn the ropes and find our way, but we hoped over time to speak to and to organize its workers, to meld our revolutionary theory with the shop floor realities and culture. End quote again. I guess my first question is I'm really curious about this period, these few years between your affiliation with the Marxist-Leninist Party to you securing employment with the New York City Transit. It looks like it was perhaps only about 2 or 3 years. I'm curious about what were you doing before then? What led you into that path and to begin participating with the Marxist-Leninist Party? And how crucial was that experience to your time in the New York City Transit Labor Union?
Well, I think that for people of my generation, and just to date me, I graduated from college in 1978. We grew up with the Vietnam War as kind of an unceasing background noise. And my best professors in college were anti-imperialists. They had been graduate students themselves at the height of the Vietnam War, and that's the lesson they learned. So I understood that piece of what the United States was. There was an imperialist power. But I hadn't thought much about the role of the state domestically. And then my first job out of college, I was trying to organize tenants in a slum area of the Bronx in New York City. And the landlords in that area were not providing any services whatsoever, just trying to collect rents until the buildings became uninhabitable. So we would organize the tenants to go on rent strike, and that just sped up the whole process. It incentivized the landlords to set fire to the buildings to collect insurance, a kind of final payday. And the role of the city government was really crucial here. The city had the right to seize buildings that had uncorrected serious housing violations and run them or turn them over to the tenants to run. Kind of very logical solutions if you don't want the Bronx burning down, as the saying went. And the real estate lobby in New York was so powerful that it refused to do so. It refused to take these steps. The city was even contemplating something called planned shrinkage. Just stop providing even basic services in whole neighborhoods of poor people, and hope that they would move out. This actually happened a few years later in Detroit. And for me, all this was tremendously radicalizing. And I happened to know some people who were involved in a particular left organization, and they went and talked to them. And to make a long story short, they said, well, you seem to have good instincts, but to really understand the underlying causes of the American political economy, you need to go join the working class.
Got it. So the approach that I mentioned in the quote that I took from the book was colonizing. How common is it in political organizing? I've never heard of it before. And I wonder, learning about that or hearing about it for the first time, does that idea stem from the Marxist-Leninist idea of forming a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries to guide the working class?
I'm glad you came back to that word, actually, because, of course, today it has a very negative connotation, a really awful connotation, like the civilized person among the savages. And, it could be that. I did see leftists that just thought they knew everything, that they would be the great savior. But here's what the Lynn said next in that quote you read: persons who have been willing to learn from their experience and whose ideas changed over the years. I think if you were honest and serious, that's how you acted, right? I could bring certain skills and perspectives to the table, but especially in my political work in the shop, it was vital to be aware and be respectful of what workers were thinking about.
And did you not identify as working class before deliberately seeking employment in a working class role? It's sort of implied from the text and from what you're saying, but your prior class context isn't clear. To the extent that class is also a cultural phenomenon, in addition to an economic one, I also wonder how your experience was managing that transition. If you met any cultural resistance to being accepted by your new peers.
So I think this goes to what I was just saying, that I had to learn to fit in. I came out of a middle-class background. My father was a lawyer for tenants. My mother was an elementary school teacher. I went to a fancy college. But I think that I had those prior years in other factory occupations. that first year, when I think about, coming into the first factory and how wide-eyed I was, I laugh about it. But I think when I got to transit, I was fortunate in two ways. First, transit workers are very diverse themselves, not just demographically, but also politically. There were people in my shop that had participated in the civil rights movement, that had political activist experience. So I didn't stand out so much there in any event. And then tensions between workers and management were often so heated, so raw, that many, probably a majority of workers in the shop, had what the sociologist Troy Bainan called factory class consciousness. I love that term. I think it's really illuminating. So in that sense, I wasn't saying things they hadn't heard or thought or talked about before. And then maybe I'll just add one thing. The book documents how I walked into the shop, a shop where workers really had a lot of control of the production process in the shop. And then management came in and tried to break that. And so, I was just part of this, this is working class struggle. I get it.
Over the span of the book, you transition from a shop floor activist to a high-ranking union officer, and now finally as a historian. I wonder, when and why did you choose to leave transit and union work? I understand that at some point you were Zohran Mamdani's teacher. Where does that all fit in?
Well, as to Zohran, I think that's just one of those things. Life can be weird, and this was a weird moment. And after all, I taught 170 students every year. So, some of them, he just happened to be one of those students, and he was a memorable student. And fortunately, when the press came calling to me, I did have an anecdote or two about him. And it was kind of fun to have 15 minutes of fame last fall. But as to leaving transit and the union, I had a disagreement that's chronicled in the book with the union president about a contract agreement. And he fired me from union staff and sent me, as we say in transit, back to tools. And, I could have continued as a transit worker for another 15 or 20 years. But here was one way I was different from, and luckier than most transit workers. I had that college degree in my pocket, and I could leave and get a job where I thought I could be of some social value. And so I became that high school social studies teacher and did that for 10 years.
Fantastic. And I understand that this book is largely an adaptation of your PhD thesis. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And what spurred you to enter academia and write the book? I assume you left teaching then to document this history. And what do you draw from your life, from these shifting vantage points that you've had?
So I had the idea of writing a book about transit in my head for a long time. And after I had taught high school for those 10 years, I was lucky enough to be admitted to the CUNY Graduate Center with this in mind. They asked me in those interviews, well, what are you going to write about? And I knew what I wanted to write about. And I thought that going through the training of being a historian would slow me down, but also result in a better, more perceptive book. And I think I was right on both counts. It also slowed me down because I got involved in union activity at CUNY. But I was also fortunate enough to have as my mentor at CUNY a historian, Joshua Freeman, who had actually written a book about the earlier period of the Transport Workers Union, and also a brilliant guy. So that was tremendously helpful. I think as to these shifting vantage points, I think it was useful to be able to actually bring three different experiences to bear as I wrote the book. As a regular transit worker dealing with management day to day in one way, then for a few years as a union officer dealing with management from a more privileged position, let's call it that. And then to be able to bring the analytic skills of an academic to bear on the evidence as well. And then finally, in those almost 20 years after transit, I had personal experience as a member and a lower level officer of two other unions. And that gave me experience. And read about many more unions, of course, during my graduate work and talked to many more activists. And that was all valuable in helping me think about what was distinctive about the Local 100 story and then what Local 100 shared in common with other unions.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That extra time that you took to go through it really comes across in the book. It's beautifully written. Okay, so let's get into the book itself and the story of this fall, rise, and fall again. In chapter 5, you write about someone else, not about yourself. Quote, Roger Toussaint came to New York as a young man from Trinidad, with experience in anti-imperialist and Black power struggles in his native country. As a part-time college student during the fiscal crisis, while working as a shipyard welder, he was involved in the struggles to defend free tuition at the City University of New York. In the early 1980s, he and I joined the Marxist-Leninist Party, a small left organization with a presence in a handful of cities. Until its dissolution in 1993, its New York branch operated much like the collaborative track committee he later headed, with decisions made democratically after discussion and deliberation. Toussaint's turn toward a more autocratic style of leadership at the Union Hall was not prefigured in his style of work in the 1980s and 1990s, end quote. So your relationship with Roger Toussaint is a central thread throughout this book. You went from being comrades in arms to being fired by him for public dissent. Can you give us a brief outline of the arc of your relationship?
Sure. I mean, maybe just to start, for your listeners, I should clarify that Toussaint became the president of Local 100 in 2001 and was president until 2009. So he's really the central figure in the book and, of course, in the union. But the arc was pretty much what you've outlined. Roger was part of the same left organization, and we were part of its so-called transit cell together, meeting every few weeks. Although his work was in a completely different transit department. I was a subway car mechanic. He worked on the tracks themselves, a much more dangerous job. And we were each writing leaflets about our own experiences, and sometimes we'd collaborate on transit-wide issues. And then later, we both participated in the New Directions Dissident Caucus, which was opposing the incumbent union leadership. And he gradually emerged as a leader within the caucus. And I was one of his 2 or 3, let's call it right-hand men. And when New Directions took control of the union in 2001, I had also been elected as an officer in my division of the union. So I was put on union staff, but instead of working as an organizer within my own work department, which was common, he gave me a series of union-wide jobs. I think partially that he trusted me, he knew me, he trusted me, and partially I did have this unusual skill set for a transit worker. I could write, I could read complex documents. I could more easily slot into what we might call administrative work. But gradually, I became disenchanted with the way he was running the union in a very top-down way. I mean, he was a brilliant guy. So he did it far more, he ran the union far more effectively than his predecessors, but it was really a betrayal of our promises to create more participatory democracy. And that led to tensions between us. And probably he thought, who is this guy that I trusted? And now he is pushing back against me. And, you talk at the union hall and you voice your concerns. And so it wasn't just tension between me and him, but, it became more common knowledge. Here's this guy, Roger's right-hand man, and he has these criticisms. And then, as I said, it all came to a head when I told a meeting of my former coworkers that I was going to vote against the contract he had just negotiated. That's the very short version. People have to read the book to better understand all the political dynamics that were at play in a union hall where a number of these former dissidents, not just me, who are now union officers, thought that they should have some say in the formulation of union policy and were not afraid to speak out about it because that's what they've been doing for 10 or 15 years, speaking out about their views. And I was one of those people.
Absolutely. So, I mean, without reading through the whole book now, maybe we can go through each of those three parts: the fall, the rise, and the fall again. The first act of the book is the fall of the old guard and the Union. The second act is the rise of this radical insurgency that you referred to, New Directions, of which you were a part. And then the third act charts their subsequent fall again into a new era of bureaucratic normalcy. In the book, you refer to the first act as, quote, fall of the House of Labor, end quote. So starting there, which after the introduction is part two of the book, it begins in the wake of the 1975 New York City fiscal crisis. Can you tell us about that?
Well, you talked about 2008 at the start, but an earlier rupture was at 1975 New York City fiscal crisis, which David Harvey, among others, identifies as the beginning of neoliberalism in the United States. And Kim Philip Fine's great book, Fear City, does a great job, a bang-up job of showing how the Ford administration, for your non-American listeners, Ford was president after Nixon from in 1974 to 1976. And he was a real fiscal moralist, and he was surrounded by people that really birthed neoliberalism. And they saw the temporary inability of the New York City government to pay its bills and possibly default on its debt as a great opportunity to roll back the progressive redistributionist elements of the New Deal and the Great Society, this idea that there should not be poor people in this country. And at the time, the New York City public employee unions were thrown off balance by massive layoffs. About 20% of the municipal workforce was laid off virtually overnight, and demands for wage freezes. And this was at a time when we were creeping toward double-digit inflation in the United States. And they basically capitulated. I mean, this is what you were talking about before, that co-optation. So that even after the immediate crisis eased some, they continue to make concessions for decades. And in transit, that especially meant work rule changes that made the work more onerous and a disciplinary reign of terror to impose those changes. And union leadership just sat passively by, sometimes complaining, but never organizing workers to fight back. And that's despite transit workers having the structural power to effectively shut down the city, which relies on mass transit. And that's the fall.
I'm not really familiar with these touchstones of U.S. history. The only background I had about the 1975 fiscal crisis in New York was the summary of it in Adam Curtis's documentary, Hypernormalization. I don't know if you'd seen it.
I have not.
He talks about Donald Trump's role in that crisis, how he took advantage of that to start buying up.
Early in his career.
Exactly.
Early in his career, he swung this deal where the city gave him a huge amount of tax exemptions and tax breaks to rehabilitate this hotel right in downtown Manhattan.
And that became the model for all of his development work. And the documentary also shows how it was the bankers boycotting the sale of municipal bonds deliberately as a kind of a bankers cartel in order to drive the city into bankruptcy that pushed them there. So I don't know if I recommend that documentary.
I recommend this Fear City book that I mentioned in the interview with you. Kim Phillips Fine wrote a book called Fear City, and it's real. There had been books written about the fiscal crisis before and kind of and then books, right? But the real virtue of that book is she blows it out to the national level, and she looks at what's going on in Washington and how they're thinking about this as a trial run for, I guess, probably your global listeners know what the New Deal is, probably not what the Great Society was. But that was Lyndon Johnson's kind of announcement that we were going to go beyond the New Deal and be even more redistributed in our economic policy. Now this was the opportunity to push it back. And kind of the two hallmarks of that in New York City were the end of the free tuition and City University of New York. And then the transit fare basically had a 50% increase in the fare just, in a year or two. And even though those didn't save that much money in and of themselves, these were announcements, public announcements. We're going to live in a different world. My mentor, Josh Freeman, has a great line about the results of the fiscal crisis that he said, we spent decades fighting to protect things that aren't good enough.
So there was a strike in 1980. It's often remembered as a failure. You argue that it was, quote, oddly successful, end quote, outlier against austerity. Can you tell us about that strike, its success, and why did the membership in general perceive a win as a defeat?
Well, this is a really interesting strike and result. I'm not sure if I ever use that term oddly successful in the book. I'd have to go back and look through it and see. But yes, I mean, the strike won an additional 8% wage increase. So kind of if you're standing on the moon and looking down, you would say the strike was a victory. 8% more every year forever. That adds up. That's a lot of money. But what that looking from the moon didn't take into account was the psychological impact of the way the strike ended. And here you have a very good example of this leadership cooptation. So after these effective real wage cuts of the fiscal crisis, and workers calculated that they had lost 30% of their wage to inflation in the 5 years between 75 and 80, workers had grown very restive. In 1979, the union president, a man named John Law, was reelected with only 37% of the vote when various opposition groups couldn't unite. They had been united, he would have been thrown out. But they did control the union's executive board, which had to approve any contract settlement, although they controlled it only by a narrow margin. And there was an actual scheme hatched between Law and management to trick the board into agreeing to another core contract. I mean, this is truth stranger than fiction stuff. And all the terrible details of that scheme are in the book, but it didn't work. They were regular workers that were sitting on the executive board. They were doing their jobs for 40 hours a week and then coming and participating on this executive board. And so they really had felt we're living with the anger, right? Those restive workers were all around them every day. And the board turned down the contract and the strike started. And Law just bided his time and tried to break the oppositionist unity. And then on the 11th day of the strike, one of those oppositionists had to leave town bizarrely to go on National Reserve Guard duty as a mess cook in Connecticut, a couple 100 miles away. And Law immediately reconvened the board. So the margin that they had was now even more narrow. And Law immediately reconvened the board and presented a new proposal. And it did have this 8% wage increase, or additional wage increase, but the oppositionists on the board argued against it, saying that this was on a Friday. And they said, well, if we can hold out till Sunday, the city is going to be more desperate. People are going to have to go back to work on the Monday. We'll get an even better deal. But Law voted twice on this new proposal. First, to create a tie in the executive board, and then again, a second time to break the tie. So many workers felt betrayed, that they could have won much more. And then they were immediately fined for this illegal strike. New York State has laws that fine workers 1 day of pay for every day they are on strike. So you lose the day of pay for being on strike. And then within 90 days, the next 90 days, workers also saw another 11 days of pay deducted from their paychecks. So for a couple of months, they were looking at these just tiny paychecks. And there was John Law claiming that this was all due to the opposition. And many workers, most workers, frankly, decided that either the strike was bad or the end was bad. And they kind of threw up their hands and said, I'll never strike again. And then those feelings wound up going hand in hand with what I was talking about earlier about conditions getting worse and the union doing nothing about that, and led to a lot of demoralization.
That does sound like a failure. I understand.
I happened to work in the same shop as one of the leaders of the oppositionists. And he had become the union shop chairman in my shop, and he had a union booth. I'd go up and listen when I had a chance to, or talk to him, and workers would come in and he would try to explain to them about how, look, mathematically, the strike was a victory. Look how much more money you're taking home every year. And I swear it was like you could watch them winning one ear and out the other. They just couldn't process what he was saying, even though he was actually factually correct.
Wow, that's such a pity. So you joined New York City Transit Union on your birthday or the day after your birthday in January 1984. And one of the first things you did was start a newsletter. What was so special about that newsletter?
Well, we have to differentiate the leaflets that I wrote about shop conditions and sometimes about general transit conditions. And they had some impact on fights within my own shop. But those leaflets were only distributed in my shop and in a few other places in the transit system, which is a sprawling system with hundreds of workplaces. So differentiate those leaflets from the New Directions newsletter, Hell on Wheels, which I also wrote for later on, which was circulated all over that system. And one of the central themes of that newsletter was to defend the 1980 strike and more militancy in general, and say the problem was not the strike. The problem was the union leadership. And we could learn to fight in the workplaces, and we could organize to replace that leadership as well. Fight the boss and fight the union to fight the boss. And this is one of the dilemmas that I describe in the book, is how much effort should be put into fighting the boss directly and how much effort should be put into fighting the union, replacing that union leadership in order to fight the boss more effectively.
So coming out of your work with the newsletter and developing these arguments, this led to the rise, which is described in part 3 of the book. Can you just sketch it out for us?
Right. Well, so after many years of organizing, of New Directions Caucus organizing, and extending the reach of the organization throughout the whole transit system, we eventually won control of most of the leadership posts in the union. And, before I said top-down Roger Toussaint, and that just sounds bad, but for a couple of years, the leadership was so much more effective and diligent than it had been, and was able to put management on the defensive sometimes, despite a lot of really bad contract language and really bad past practices that we inherited. And workers were excited. That factory class consciousness I talked about before it kicked in. Like, we're going to follow Toussaint and we're going to win. And there was a real enthusiasm. You go out and talk to workers, and they were bought in, right? This is our chance. During contract negotiations, and that kind of reached an apogee. The apogee of the rise is the our first contract negotiations in 2002. And we had enormous demonstrations in Midtown Manhattan. At some of them, half of all transit workers, 15,000 people up in the streets. And you have to remember that when you have that demonstration at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, another quarter or a third of transit workers are working, right? Or driving trains or driving buses. Actually, the picture on the front cover of the book is my friend and comrade, J.P. Patafio, leading a feeder march from a bus depot on the west side of Manhattan across 42nd Street in Times Square. That's where the picture is, to join a big rally on the other side of town. And not just demonstrations. We had some serious job actions and slowdowns that year. Like, for the first time in decades, transit workers were in motion at their workplaces as well. And we had a lot of offensive contract demands, offensive as opposed to defensive. So not offensive as in making you angry, but plans to win back things that we had lost ground on. We had a lot of strike preparations. And a lot of workers thought that either management was going to cave or we were going to go out and strike to win them, that this was our time. And I thought, I had the feeling myself, we're going to win. But then it didn't happen, or it didn't happen as much even then.
Yeah, it's a bit of a heartbreaking story to move from that momentum and optimism so swiftly to the penultimate section of the book, where you describe the final fall again. It begins in 2003, more or less. But what was the trigger for you that marked the beginning of a decline from all of that optimism and momentum and forward movement?
So in retrospect, I think that even as we were coming up to this apogee in the fall of 2002 and to the strike deadline in December 15th, 2002, you could see warning signs. The interesting thing about those negotiations was that we started out with almost 24 negotiating tables, not just many different issues, but with virtually any union officer, and Local 100 has hundreds of union officers involved at one negotiating table or another. We had invited a whole new cadre of shop stewards. We had trained 1,000 shop stewards in those first 2 years, and we invited them to help in the development of those demands. A lot of democratic participation. And gradually we let go of that. I mean, I was in the middle of that, right? I was Toussaint's right-hand man. I was organizing all the negotiation processes, and I was complicit in this. But the shop stewards were never reconvened. The number of union negotiators got smaller and smaller. I mean, this isn't unusual in American labor union practice, but we had vowed not to do this. And finally, it got down to a handful. And then finally, only Toussaint was there when the final deal was struck. And Toussaint decided that the deal he struck was good enough. Well, was it? I mean, I sort of leave that up to the reader to decide. I lay out the terms, but I had said no. Toussaint said yes. He argued both that the wins were big enough, what we had gained was big enough, and that striking had risks, which is true. And particularly, they had risks because this was just a year after 9/11, after the destruction of the World Trade Center. And so striking had more particular risks, the feeling that New Yorkers would see this as a stab in the back. But what was significant about that decision not to go on strike was three things. First, a lot of transit workers, but also transit management, decided that we had never intended to go on strike. For the most militant workers, that led to a certain disappointment and maybe a lack of preparedness and activity during the next contract round. For management, it meant they could take a harder line next time, that the union would blink, just as it had in 2002. Second, the fact that they believed that the union would blink also incentivized management to sabotage a lot of things we thought we had won in those negotiations. So we have a list of things. Look, we didn't do so well in these ways, but here are the accomplishments we had. And then a lot of those seen accomplishments didn't bear fruit. And so that also increased worker disappointment and management confidence that they were able to do this and get away with it. And third, Toussaint had promised during the ratification vote that the union would be better prepared in 2005. But just the opposite turned out to be true. Those top-down tendencies just got exacerbated, and that led to increasing division within the union and a lot of infighting that distracted from fighting management and organizing readiness for the 2005 contract negotiations. And that's very clear when you compare the preparations in 2002 with those in the next contract round in 2005.
It sounds like what you're saying, the decline begins with the decision not to strike, but then there is the second strike, or a positive decision to strike in 2005. And it's arguably that the issues around the 2005 strike form the climax of the book. The 2005 strike is called by leadership to protect pension benefits for future, not current, employees. Why was that specific issue chosen? Did it have any particular importance, or was it just the excuse that was needed to call a strike that was overdue? Tell us more about the 2005 strike.
Well, it was really management that chose the issue. And that goes with that they thought that the union was weaker than in 2002, and so they could press an offensive demand. And so they could go back to demanding concessions. And a very common concession in the 1980s and 1990s was worsening pay or benefits for future workers. And the logic is that current workers will agree to that because it doesn't affect them. But management had misread the union, at least on this issue and in this case. A lot of workers themselves had themselves been victories of an earlier worsening of the pension system. New York state law says you can't worsen the pension system for current workers, but only for future workers. And anyone that had come into the system between 1976 and 2000 had worked alongside older workers who had a much superior pension system. And they looked at their own pension system. It's worse. And now here was management saying, we're going to make it even worse again for the future workers. And so even though this new change wasn't going to affect them, it had a lot of resonance. Like I've always complained that those older workers stuck me with this worse pension system, and damned if I'm going to do it to the guys coming in behind me. And Toussaint and his executive board, to their credit, didn't back down on this issue, and they didn't blink as management had thought they would. And so they went out on strike.
That sounds inspiring. As you mentioned earlier, the strike ended in betrayal, with Toussaint being the sole arbiter on the final deal. Can you tell us about that betrayal?
Well, I think we need to separate the need to strike and the willingness to strike from a sort of lack of calculation about how to put yourself in the best position to win a strike. I talked earlier about how Local 100 has the ability to shut down the city. That's its leverage. And then the weakness it faces are the state's anti-strike law that takes money out of the pocket of the union and of workers. So the contract was set to expire on December 15th. But the union, for various reasons, did not go out on strike until December 20th. And that meant there were only 3, maybe 4 days of impact until the city shut down for Christmas, basically until New Year's Day, until after New Year's Day. Many businesses are closed. And of course, the entire school system is closed during that time. And that really forced the union to limit the length of the strike, because if they had continued on strike through that period of almost another 7 or 8 days, they really have very little impact. And yet the fines still continue to build up and up and up. I mean, I don't speculate much in this book, right? Because I'm not trying to rewind the videotape and play it again. But I do suggest that it would have been better to postpone the start date of the strike until after the new year, when New York City goes back to work. And that would have had a certain resonance with transit workers, because the one transit strike that everyone agrees was a great victory in 1966 started on New Year's Day. And so you could have maybe said, we're going to do what the president at that time, Mike Quill, did, and we're going to follow in his footsteps. And that may have created kind of a psychological uplift going into the strike. Anyway, that is speculative. The union went out on the 20th, and Toussaint, again negotiating alone, made a deal on the 3rd day. And maybe it was the best deal he could make at the moment, with the clock essentially ticking on him. But he went to the union's executive board, and rather than tell them, look, here's this agreement, he just told them management took the pension change demand off the table so we can call off the strike. And he didn't tell them, what he hid from them, therefore, was that he had agreed that all workers now, not just new workers, but all workers would bear new health benefit costs instead. You know, here in the United States, it's very common that almost all health insurance is privatized, and a union negotiates a health benefit package with the employer, and you might pay certain premiums or out-of-pocket costs for those health benefits. And those costs went up in this contract, but he didn't tell them that when he asked the executive board to vote to end the strike. So we'll never know, of course, if the executive board would have ended the strike if they had known about this different concession, essentially taking the pension change off the table, but putting health benefit changes on the table. What we do know is that workers, when they eventually voted on the agreement, turned it down. And the main reason was what one worker I quote in the book wrote to Toussaint: I was better off, I, as an individual, as a current worker, was better off with management's final offer before the strike started than I was with what we came back with. We protected the future workers, but I did not expect that I would suffer from the strike financially.
What a scandal.
I mean, I ask in the book, actually, which was ethically worse, John Law voting twice in 1980 or Roger Toussaint not telling the board that he had an agreement in his hand when he asked for the strike to end. Once the strike was ended, there was no way that once the deal was revealed a week later that the executive board was going to renew the strike. It was kind of the momentum is lost.
Absolutely. It's heartbreaking. Okay, so that's a rough sketch of the fall, rise and fall again described in the book. Just before Christmas last year, you wrote an article in Jacobin repeating some of the arguments we've discussed so far. And this provoked Roger Toussaint into a rebuttal. He published a rebuttal in the same magazine. His response included arguments that the, quote, December 2005 New York City transit strike was a success because we walked out to prevent an arbiter from imposing a Tier 6 pension, and we blocked that outcome decisively. And he also says that they also took a 10.5% wage increase. It also includes Toussaint's rebuttal article, an accusation that you, quote, you offer as evidence of Local 100's decline, a set of observations and opinions that reflect the state of the union's later condition, retrofitting them to before 2009, which is when Toussaint left, to support your argument, end quote. Toussaint also says that the characterization that you claim, quote, the prevailing lesson in narrative or the scar left by the 2005 strike was that strikes are bad and to be avoided at all costs, end quote, which... Anyway, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to Toussaint's rebuttal article in Jacobin. Have you seen the article and what did you think of it?
I have, yes. And I didn't choose to respond there, but they gave me the chance, but I'm happy to just make some general points here. The one thing that Toussaint relies on in this argument is readers' natural ignorance about New York State labor law, which says that only the state legislature can change the pension plan. So what the management was asking was that the union and management go up jointly to Albany, the state capital, and ask for this worsened pension plan. But an arbitrator, but legally an arbitrator simply cannot impose what the law calls a non-mandatory subject of bargaining. So there are many reasons to avoid arbitration, but Toussaint's so-called reason is not one of them. As to the results and consequences of the strike, it's kind of bizarre to hear Toussaint claim, I believe strikes are to be avoided at all costs, when the final point of rupture between us it was that I felt Local 100 should have struck in 2002. Very unfortunately, though, his poor management of the strike meant that many workers did decide that strikes are bad. You know, in the book, I'm very clear on the distinction between the character of the final Toussaint years and what came after. What came after was just kind of normal, problematic union practice, right? What we are used to in the United States and what we are used to in New York City, service unionism, bureaucratization, a disinclination to fight. The particular characteristic of Toussaint's presidency was this constant infighting among elected officers, right? That was new, different than what came after. And his other unique contribution to the decline of Local 100 was rank and file demoralization with the union and union action. By the time he fled to a staff job at the International Transport Workers, rather than face a re-election campaign in 2009, half of the union's members were in bad standing for failure to pay some or all of their dues. Now did not happen after 2009. That happened on Toussaint's watch. You know, I have an appendix to the book where I include a memo that I wrote to Toussaint in December 2000, right after New Directions had won the union election and right before we took office. I thought it would be useful for readers to measure my thinking about union tasks in 2000 from my analysis a quarter century later. Like, let's see what Kagan thought in the moment. And one thing I wrote was, quote, the most important things we must learn to say are, I was wrong. I messed up. I'll try to do better next time. I take full responsibility for that. We must create a new culture at the union hall and not become the problem all over again. And this new culture must spring from the top officers. They must set the example. So look, I don't minimize how hard that is because, you're running the union and you have people that are in opposition and they're going to jump on any admission of responsibility for things that go wrong. But Toussaint never learned to do that, never learned to say, I messed up. He was a brilliant guy. He was often farsighted. He was often a good strategist, but he was a poor manager and he avoided taking responsibility for mistakes. And so if you're going to avoid responsibility for those mistakes, you have to blame other people. That's what he's doing here.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious. Even without knowing anything, the tone of the article makes it clear that it's a bit of a response to give a response. So with that heartbreak in mind, the last section of the book, before you get into those appendices, tries to ask some broader questions about the broader lessons we can draw. And the book jacket cover pitches out the highlights of those questions on the key dilemmas that unions face. Among them, fight the boss or fight the union to fight the boss, the tension between leadership and participatory democracy, as obviously becomes clear with your tensions with Toussaint, and then finally, the costs and benefits of risk aversion. So starting with the first one, I must say as a Palestinian, I really connected with reading about the New Direction strategy to fight the union to fight the boss. It's well known among Palestinians that the Palestinian Authority, which represents us in the world, is really a tool of Israel and the United States. And activists in the West Bank consistently point to this limitation, including Nizar Banat, who was beaten to death by a squad of PA security forces precisely for criticizing the PA's collaboration with Israel. I could go on for hours on that theme. But reflecting back, do you still believe fight the union to fight the boss was the correct strategy for the union? Can you explain the more general logic behind that approach? And do you think that lesson is transferable to other contexts?
I do feel that some of the lessons I'm trying to draw have applicability to social movements in general, other than labor. But I kind of feel humbled by your making this parallel to Palestine. I mean, what you're describing is real tragedy and life and death stakes. But if I might use your example, you're raising the need to oppose the Palestinian Authority, but it seems apparent that the main task remains to fight Israeli oppression. So who's the main enemy, right? At the same time that you're trying to calculate strategically what are the immediate tasks, keeping the main enemy in sight is also important. There's a famous saying from a leftist American labor leader of the 1930s. He says, workers should fight the boss, and then the union leadership gets caught in the crossfire. That is, they get exposed for their unwillingness to participate in the fight, and workers see the need to replace them. The danger, I think, for union activists in making the union leadership the main target of their work, or even the sole target of their work, is that the fight against management gets set aside for a later date. And that means all workers are ever asked to do is cast a vote and throw the bums out. They never gain the experience of organizing in the workplace or of feeling a sense of agency and potential empowerment that comes from that organizing in the workplace. And frankly, the activists, now the new leadership of the union, didn't have these experiences either, because their work was solely concentrated on let's expose the union leadership, let's get people to vote to replace them with us. As a group, once we got down to the union hall, as a group, we were far more tentative than we should have been about organizing fights in the workplace because we had so rarely done it before. So you asked about transferable. What I think is transferable is two things. The notion of a dilemma is that often there is no one right principled answer, that will always be the right answer, but you have to actually analyze the costs and the benefits of different paths and choices that you're making. Or, sometimes what is the right answer today has new costs tomorrow. And so So the second thing is that demands constant introspection, right? Yet collective introspection turns out to be its own dilemma because there are so many urgent tasks that it's easy not to want to take the time and psychic energy to stop and reassess, yet it's vitally necessary.
Yeah, and I think part of that is the next question that's raised. You argue that the rise of the union under New Directions failed to become an authentic revolution because leadership chose an army model of top-down control over a democratic town meeting model of participatory democracy. I think you, in some way, you've answered this question already, but to make it more clear, why does an army model inevitably lead to bureaucracy and failure?
Well, I'm not sure that anything is inevitable. That's such a strong word. But I really think you're asking two separate questions. There are times when it is vitally necessary to act in lockstep against the class enemy. But even in a real army, which is by definition a bureaucracy, right? You have a bureaucracy, generals and colonels and so on down the line. Even in a real army, successful generals take time to listen to the experiences and observations of their captains and colonels. And they are listening to the reports of their sergeants and lieutenants and so on, at least in a successful army, right? Information and ideas need to go up as well as down. Now, a union is actually a volunteer army, right? Once when I said that to students, one student said, oh, they're really a militia. So like even more, like no one can order them to march into battle, right? They have a choice to enter or leave the battlefield. And what I describe about the period after the 2005 strike that Toussaint chooses to deny is that the Union Army just withered away. So that's one thing. But the second thing is turning now to the question of democratic town meeting. When we look at studies of unions that are successful over a long period of time, we consistently see higher levels of participatory democracy. I mean, I discussed them in the book, but there's a great book called Left Out, which studied a couple of dozen international unions. That is, unions, it's the broader union that covers the whole country. Let's say the UAW is an international union, and then it has individual locals at different workplaces. But they studied a couple of dozen international unions and hundreds of locals over a span of about 15 years from 1940 to about 1955. And they found direct correlation between high levels of democracy and success in bargaining. I guess this is three things. Finally, there's sort of an ideological question, whether we can live the world we are trying to make. Staunton Lynn has this great quote. He says, workers' control is beautiful because it can only come about by the creation of human beings capable of administering it. And you know what? A part of a union's task should be the creation of human beings. Participatory democracy demands human beings that have decided to collectively participate rather than just sit on the sidelines. That also, not just higher wages or better benefits, should be the aspiration of an organization of workers.
That's beautifully said. That really resonates with me. I was also wondering about your argument for more participatory organizing, and specifically how it squares with the colonizer or vanguard intention you had when first joining the union. Is it possible for a militant leadership, whether New Directions or anything else, to engineer a democratic rank and file, or is that idea, that aspiration, a contradiction in terms?
Well, I already talked a bit about the potential danger if you really thought of yourself as a colonizer. But I do spend a lot of time discussing this term bottom-up change from the top, which was suggested by another activist, and I picked up on her idea. It really has a central place in the book as both opportunity and danger. I think when you have institutions which have a legacy and a culture of passivity, or even mobilization, but not real participation and voice, it's difficult to simply announce, well, now we're going to do things differently and better, and everything snaps into place. So I think there's an obligation on leadership, on good leadership, to create new forms that enable and encourage rank and file democracy. Now, maybe that is engineering. But, even I'll match your Palestinian metaphor with one of my own. Even in the best possible scenario, this state withers away. It doesn't just vanish. So I guess maybe I lack the imagination to envisage a union without a president or some type of collective leadership. But I certainly can imagine a leadership which gives up the sole power of decision-making and distributes it downwards, and a membership which is jealous of preserving its democratic prerogatives. That's at least what we should be aspiring to.
Yeah, that sounds lovely. And it would certainly prevent the betrayals that you retell in the story, because they wouldn't be possible by having a singular person or group of people at the top who are in a position to betray their members in the first place. The last lesson plucked out to highlight from your conclusions on the jacket cover vaguely refers or cryptically refers to the costs and benefits of risk aversion. What do you mean by that?
Well, risk is by definition risky, right? Things can go wrong. You can incur costs. But look at the flip side, right? If all you're thinking about is what are the costs that I can incur, right? Then you are giving up the opportunity to go on the offensive. In 1975, none of those New York City municipal unions wanted to take the risk of fighting back against economic austerity. They thought, or they hoped, that this would just be some temporary blip that they could ride out. Instead, even after the worst was over, we've had 45 years of drip, 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 steady regression. They were risk averse. They always felt they had, at any point, they felt they had too much to lose. And then that creates a certain Darwinian logic within the unions, right? Leaders who are risk averse promote people that think like that, right? If you agitate for more militancy within the union, you don't rise up through the ranks. There are exceptions, mostly when dissidents have ousted incumbent leaders, and we can look at unions that have bucked this trend and are willing to take risks, but mostly this is still what American unions are like today, right? Afraid to take risks.
So lately in the United States, we've been seeing a resurgence in labor organizing, most famously Mr. Smalls in New York now, at Amazon. We've also seen some controversial labor action at Starbucks over the past couple of years, as well as in other places. How do you see these more recent developments? Are you more optimistic or pessimistic? If you could give them any advice, maybe you are advising them, but for the purposes of our listenership here, if you could give advice to labor activists today, what advice would you give them?
Well, let's start by going back to the day before Trump's inauguration. The resurgence you're talking about had actually not yet shown up in the statistics and the percentage of workers that are unionized in this country, which is still very low, only about 10%, and among private sector workers, about 6%. And it's different from in, let's say, France, where there are low percentages, but still the unions represent, the whole workforce, right? Within a particular workplace, only some workers may be in the union, and yet the union bargains for the whole workplace. And that's not true in the United States. You have to have that majority of the workforce that chooses to be in a union for the union to have a role in bargain. But even if it hadn't shown up in the statistics, there was definitely a sense that more people were in motion, that they were trying to unionize, even at major Fortune 500 companies where it's been typically difficult to unionize, or in the South, where the state governments are so hostile to union organizing that maybe we were going to have a big breakthrough at Amazon or Starbucks. And this was going to lead to a great surge of union organizing, like has happened a few other times in American history. And now we've had a year of Trump. For your global audience, it's probably hard to understand the almost schizophrenic feeling of activists here. On the one hand, we're watching the incredibly swift rollout of fascist authoritarianism and the capitulation of so many unions. Sorry, not just of unions and so many other institutions. The unions are just capitulating along with the Harvards and the various institutions we think of as quote unquote liberal democracy. My old TWU never says a word about Trump, never. Right? You scroll their website, you look at it, they have nothing to say about because they're afraid of getting on Trump's bad side. And they're not alone. So that even where people are in motion, right, and trying to figure out how to be in motion, and there are many people trying to do that, the unions, with only a few exceptions, are far, far behind, sometimes almost invisible. So that people, even people within unions, don't really see their unions as a vehicle, let alone the vehicle to oppose Trump. I mean, I went to we have these marches called No Kings marches that are organized all over the country. And the most recent one was in October. And there was the No Kings march of hundreds of thousands of people in New York City. And then the unions, some unions, organized a separate march. What's going on? Of 3,000 or 4,000 people that started in a different place and ended in a different place. And so what you'd have to say is that most people that are in unions in New York City, they marched in the big march. They didn't see that the virtue of coming and marching with a few thousand people with their union. And yet, we're talking now, I don't know when this is going to air, but we're talking 5 days after the general strike in Minneapolis. And that just amazing, right? We don't really yet have the full details on how many people did not work, but it's pretty clear that a bunch of locally based unions, even if they tiptoed around the word strike for legal reasons, endorsed the call for no work, which is the same thing, of course. And a lot of the members did not go to work. And I have this great quote from one local union organizer. She said, "This doesn't have to be perfect for it to be impactful. There are likely tens of thousands of people who are doing the first ever workplace action that they've ever done, ever thought about doing, and they are going to realize that they can do this." So, I mean, that's very inspiring to me. So, I mean, insofar as I had advice for these people that are actually on the ground doing the organizing, doing the hard work of organizing, it's just what they are doing. Don't bow down, right? Be imaginative. They're inventing tactics there in Minneapolis, right? Showing the rest of the country what could be done. Look for opportunities. And you can apply those ideas. Don't bow down, be imaginative, look for opportunities, not just in the fight against Trump, but also in the fight against the employer. Meanwhile, the national AFL, start now back to the bad side, the national AFL-CIO, supposedly the organizing center of the American labor movement, said not a word about Minneapolis. I scrolled their site on the day of the general strike, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing on their homepage about this amazing development. So fight more.
Yeah, I suppose then with an eye towards wrapping up, zooming out as broadly as possible, what can all of us learn from the successes and failures of union history over the period of the book as we all attempt to build a better world?
If we want to fight fascism, right? If we want to win in our workplaces, we must be less risk averse. We need to listen to our members, the rank and file, right? We need to listen to the rank and file, but also encourage them to think more boldly too, to believe that their agency and their action can change the world. More real democracy, more militancy, more class struggle against the employer, and also more generally against neoliberalism and capitalist oppression. And this is not my own particular insight, but it's something that people are talking a lot about here in the United States. Can we encourage participatory democracy? Can we encourage people to think that they have a voice? So Zoran, in his inaugural speech, talked about the first two things, right? Like fast and free buses, free childcare, freeze the rent. And then he also, maybe surprising some people, he also talked about we want the provision of city services to actually be looked at as like these are done really well. We're not just providing schools, we're providing good schools. We're not just providing transit, we're providing good transit. But then for the second or third day, he announced what is being called the Office of Mass Engagement. So we don't really know about it yet, right? They're still staffing up and I guess trying to figure out what they could do. But then on the day after, what was it he did? He said it was involving housing. And he said he wanted the Office of Mass Engagement to be involved and not just his housing agencies, because he wanted to make sure that the renters and the tenants actually had their voice heard. So we'll have to see, right, how this plays out. But at least that's a good sign, right? That he's not just saying housing agency, do a better job. And I've actually written to them and tried to reach out to them and said, if you want to do mass engagement, that a logical place to start would be with the municipal unions, with your own employees, with municipal workers and municipal unions, with your own employees, that, like the classic paradigm of who knows how to work best, it's the workers. And why don't you listen to them for a change? And it would involve a tremendous change in the way union contracts are bargained and the way agencies are administered. But if we're going to start, we should start by under the socialist mayor. This is our chance. We need to talk more about what we are fighting for rather than just against, and describe that better world that we want to make.
Bravo. Bravo. I think that's a beautiful place for us to end. Dr. Kagan, thank you so much for this lovely conversation.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It was great to be here, and this is very enjoyable.
That was Dr. Marc Kagan, and this has been another episode of Sustainability Matters. Don't forget, you can also participate in the podcast. Let us know what you think of Sustainability Matters. If you would like us to cover any particular topics in future episodes, or if you have thoughts on labor activism that you would like us to explore, write to us and let us know. Our email is podcast@brill.com. We would love to hear from you, and if enough of you write to us about labor activism or any other topic related to sustainability in scholarly publishing and beyond, we do promise to explore it in another episode. Thank you as always for being with us. I am your host, Ramsey Nasser. See you again next month.
You are listening to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill.